Chapter 20. All Astir. A day or two passed and there was great activity aboard the Pequod. Not only were the old sails being mended, but new sails were coming on board in bolts of canvas and coils of rigging. In short, everything betokened that the ship's preparations were hurrying to a close. Captain Peleg seldom or never went ashore, but sat in his wigwam keeping a sharp lookout upon the hands. Bildad did all the purchasing and providing at the stores, and the men employed in the hold and on the rigging were working till long after nightfall. In the day following Queequeg signing the articles, word was given that all the inns where the ship's company were stopping, that their chests must be on board before night, for there was no telling how soon the vessel might be sailing. So Queequeg and I got down to our traps, resolving, however, to sleep ashore till the last. But it seems that they always give very long notice in these cases, and the ship did not sail for several days. But no wonder, there was a good deal to be done, and there was no telling how many things to be thought of before the Pequod was fully equipped. Everyone knows what a multitude of things, beds, saucepans, knives and forks, shovels, tongs, napkins, nutcrackers, and what not, are indispensable to the business of housekeeping. Just so with whaling, which necessitates a 3 years' housekeeping upon the wide ocean, far from all grocers, costermongers, doctors, bakers, and bankers. And though this also holds true of merchant vessels, yet not by means to the same extent as with whalemen. For besides the great length of the whaling voyage, the numerous articles peculiar to the prosecution of fishery, and the impossibility of replacing them at the remote harbors usually frequented must be remembered. That of all ships, whaling vessels are the most exposed to accidents of all kind, and especially to the destruction and loss of the very things upon which the success of the voyage most depends. Hence the spare boats, spare spars, spare lines and harpoons, and spare everythings, almost, but a spare captain in a duplicate ship. At the period of our arrival at the island, the heaviest storage of the Pequod had been almost completed, comprising her beef, bread, water, fuel, and iron, hoops, and staves. But as before hinted, sometime there was a continual fetching and carrying on board of divers odds and ends of things, both large and small. Chief among those who did this fetching and carrying was Captain Bildad's sister, a lean old lady of most determined and indefatigable spirit, but withal very kind-hearted, who seemed resolved that, if she could help it, nothing should be found wanting in the Pequod, after once fairly getting to sea. At one time she would come on board with a jar of pickles for the steward's pantry, another time with a bunch of quills for the chief mate's desk where he kept his log, a third time with a roll of flannel for the small of someone's rheumatic back. Never did any woman better deserve her name, which was Charity. Aunt Charity, as everybody called her, and like a sister of Charity did this charitable Aunt Charity bustle and about hither and thither, ready to turn her hand and heart to anything that promised to yield safety, comfort, and consolation to all on board a ship in which her beloved brother Bildad was concerned, and in which she herself owned a score or two of well-saved dollars. But it was startling to see this excellent-hearted Quakeress coming on board as she did the last day, with a long oil ladle in one hand and a still longer whaling lance in the other. Nor was Bildad himself nor Captain Peleg at all backward. As for Bildad, he carried about with him a long list of the articles needed, and at every fresh interval down went his mark opposite that article upon the paper. Every once in a while Peleg came hobbling out of his whalebone den, roaring at the men down the hatchways, roaring up to the riggers at the masthead, and then concluded by roaring back into his wigwam. During these days of preparation, Queequeg and I often visited the craft, and as often as I asked about Captain Ahab and how he was, and when he was going to come aboard his ship. To these questions they would answer that he was getting better and better, and he was expected aboard every day. Meantime, the two captains, Peleg and Bildad, could attend to everything necessary to fit the vessel for the voyage. If I had been downright honest with myself, I would have seen very plainly in my heart that I did but half fancy being committed this way to so long a voyage, without once laying my eyes on the man who was to be the absolute dictator of it. So soon as the ship sailed out upon the open sea, but when a man suspects any wrong, it sometimes happens that if he had already been involved in the matter, he insensibly strives to cover up his suspicions even from himself. And much this way it was with me. I said nothing and tried to think nothing. At last it was given that at some time next day the ship would certainly sail. So next morning Queequeg and I took a very early start. That is the end of chapter 20. Now they are preparing for a long, long voyage, 3 years. And they're going to be going into places where there isn't going to be a lot of ports like they're used to. It isn't going to be, ports like you find in the Americas, like you find in Canada, like you find in England or France or most of Europe. It's going to be small islands in the South Pacific where the whales are. It's going to be islands in the Aleutians. It's going to be wilderness off of the coast of Russia. It's going to be wilderness in California, because at this point California wasn't a state. Oregon, this is right at the beginning of the settlement of California, so there was no real industry out there. So if they needed anything metal, it pretty much had to be made on the east coast of the US. Maybe in the middle, Chicago would have some industry, or it'd have to be made in Europe, which means that if they needed harpoon heads, which had to be good steel, they had to carry them. If they wanted nails, they had to carry them. If they wanted hoops to make barrels, they had to carry them. And they needed lots of barrels, because they go and they bring the whale oil back in big round barrels. And to make a barrel, you take a bunch of staves, and they're slightly narrow at each end, and they're slightly narrower towards the middle, and you press them together with rings. And the slightly narrower pieces come to form a circle. So the narrower pieces come to form a circle, and then because they get narrow at the top, the barrel narrows down to the top. And you can put a flat lid in, and you have a thin cut around the inside of the barrel staves, and the lid fits into that, and the barrel staves latch on like this over top of the lid. And then you set down the rings and pound them into place, and this puts the whole thing just kind of under compression. So the wood's trying to squeeze back out, because the wood's being squeezed down by the metal rings, and because the wood's being squeezed down so tight, it forms a watertight seal around the inside of the barrel. So if you store liquid in the barrel like oil, it won't leak. And it's difficult in other ways to make solid shaped vessels that don't have punctures or closings, but because this has all of these closings which are being forced together by the tension of the steel rings, the barrels are very sturdy. Now, Aunt Charity, Beldad's sister, Charity was a very common name. It's a nice name. I know some people named Charity, but she was intensely prepared, just like your Lolly, and she wanted to make sure that everyone had everything that they needed, just like your Lolly does. Your Lolly is like the master of preparation and taking care of other people. In our recent trip across the country, she was responsible for so much of the planning and so much of the preparation and so much of the, okay, we need this, we need that, we need the other thing. I mean, we got a car seat just for you, and that car seat was used for 2 weeks and likely will not be used again. We'll probably just clean it up and get rid of it at a yard sale or something, or donate it to someone who has a new kid. But that was the intent, and we planned for all sorts of things that didn't. We had a fire extinguisher in the car. Your lolly got a fire extinguisher for the car, so just in case we were in the middle of nowhere and somebody else's car was on fire, we could put it out. We have an air compressor, so if the tire goes flat. We have flares. Oh, so many flares. Because your lolly's like, hey, do we have flares? Yes, we have flares. Oh, we'll just get more. So we have like a whole bunch of flares in the trunk. And your lolly is 5? Okay. I guess we used some. Okay. So anyway, Aunt Charity is, and she cares about everybody, and a bit of flannel for somebody's rheumatic back. Now, rheumatism is an inflammation of the joints related to arthritis. It is a type of arthritis. So if you hear someone say, oh, my rheumatism, that's achy joints, usually the back, and it's not fun, and people who are in pain get grumpy. But here she's just getting stuff for the ship to make sure it's done and everything's ready, and she even has some of her own money in it. And remember how I told you about how this was a very common thing, and where you go and you invest money in business ventures of the people around you. So the whole town had a little bit of money. Well, not the whole town, but a lot of the town had a little bit of money in the Pequod and the Tit-Bit and the Devil's Dam, the 3 whaling ships that were about to go out. So all 3 of those ships had a little bit of everybody's money in it. And maybe Peleg didn't have any of his money in the Devil's Dam. Maybe it was all in the Pequod. Maybe he spread his money out. Who knows? But it was fairly common, for everyone to go and invest in these business ventures. Where, this is something that could raise the whole town up, because you put in a little bit of money and then you get a lot of money back. So for her $20, when the ship comes back with oil, it may come back with, she may get $50 or $100 out of that. And so this is a way to build up money with a little bit of risk. But she's taking care of it and just taking care of everything, and a ladle and a harpoon. So imagine a 50, 60-year-old lady, a little bit frail, gray hair, running around carrying a huge spear. That might have been a sight. The ladle I can see. The ladle, making the soup, but a spear? Then again, I guess, we aren't used to whaling towns where I guess everyone carried harpoons. So that is the end of 20.